Good morning and welcome members, invited guests and members of public both in the gallery here at City Hall and those watching on webcast to today's meeting of Regeneration Committee at City Hall. Members of the public may like to follow us on Twitter at London Assembly and take part in the meeting discussion using hashtag Assembly Regeneration and hashtag Town Centres. Our main topic of discussion today is, can regenerating London's town centres deliver good growth? But before we do that, we have a few short items of formal business to go through. So can we please get to our business with those brief items. Please make sure that your electronic devices are switched off or are on the silent mode to avoid unnecessary disruption to this meeting. Can I start by asking Teresa if any apologies have been received?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Apologies have been received from the Deputy Chairman, Assembly Member Bailey.
We have no reserve.
And we have no substitute.
Okay, that's noted. Declarations of interest. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 of the report? Thank you. And can I ask Assembly members to declare any other disclosable pecuniary interests and other relevant interests, including any declarations in relation to gifts and hospitality which are not reflected on the authority's register of gifts and hospitality where they relate to the items on the agenda for today's meeting? I believe there are none. Okay, thank you. We can move to the next item. In fact, we'll have items 3, 4 and 5 which are about membership, terms of reference of this committee, standing delegations of authority. Can we note the committee's membership and terms of reference for this year as agreed at the AGM of the London Assembly on 3rd of May 2017, and they are set out on the agenda. Can we also note our standing delegation as set out on the agenda as well, members? Yeah, thank you. Moving on to the next item, which is number 6, minutes. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting of the Regeneration Committee held on 1st of March 2017 to be signed by me as correct record? Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Item number 7, which is summary list of actions. Can we note the completed and outstanding actions arising from a previous meeting of the committee? Yeah. Item 8, actions taken under delegated authority. Can we note 3 items in this instance? The first one is note the action taken by me under delegated authority as set out in the report. Number 2, can we note our report creative tensions and the response to it from the London Legacy Development Corporation? And the third one, can we note our report broadband and digital connectivity in London, which was published early this month? And can we also note the summaries of our site visits? Thank you. Right. It's coming along nicely. Right. Now, can we get on to our main item on the agenda, which is can regenerating London's town centres deliver good growth? Before we welcome our guests, can we agree the scope in terms of reference for this review as set out in the report? Thank you. Right. Can I now welcome our guests to the meeting and invite them to introduce themselves? Can we start with Denise, please?
I'm Denise Beedell. I'm the Development Manager for the Federation of Small Businesses in Greater London.
Hi, I'm Mark Billington. I head the Economic Development team in Adult Community Learning at Harrow Council.
I'm Johnny Birkett. I'm the Chief Executive of Nightworks and I'm also the Managing Director of Placing. Good morning. My name is Gerard Burgess. I'm a Senior Strategic Planner in the GLA's London Plan team.
Hello, I'm Erin Byrne. I'm a Principal Project Officer from the GLA's Regeneration team.
Thank you very much. Once again, thanks very much for coming along this morning, for your input. If I can start with the opening couple of questions, and that is generally on the situation with town centres and how they are faring, because the last mayor's report we had in 2014, it talked about performance of town centres, and the assessment kind of indicated that there was a mixed kind of picture when it came to how regeneration was shaping. So can I ask, if you can start with Gerard, how has London town centre situation fared in the near decade since the financial crash in 2008?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Chair. So at this very moment in time, we are undertaking a London-wide health check, looking at the health and vitality of town centres across London. More than 200 town centres are contained within the data sets that we're currently analysing. And we have a range of data sets which look at issues around floor space, around vacancy, financial performance, community safety and environment. And we're currently very busy analysing all of that data across London's town centres. Now today, I would like to give you some very tentative initial findings on two of the key metrics that will feature among the health check report. And those two metrics that I'd like to discuss are vacancy rates, which are a very useful indicator of town centres' health, and rental levels, which are another good indicator of the financial performance of different town centres. But as I say, these are very early indications. The data still needs to be verified and tested, but I would just like to share with you some of these emerging findings. So if I start, first of all, with vacancy rates, and it's always nice to start on a positive note, and that's, as a general proposition, on average, vacancy rates have been falling across all different types of town centres since the financial crisis around 2008, 2009. What the data is showing is that there is the strongest reduction in vacancy rates amongst the international and metropolitan town centres in London. So the larger and stronger town centres have tended to see the greatest reductions in vacancy. But on average, the smaller district centres have also seen an average decline in their vacancy rates. But I must stress that this does mask, although this is an average measure, it does mask differences between certain centres which may have seen vacancy rates rise, whereas others will have seen their vacancy rates fall. And that responds to your point right at the start, that each centre is different, and we must, when we look at the data on the individual centres, which we will in the health check report, it will highlight some of those differences across the centres. Now, another interesting fact that we're seeing coming forward from the data is suggesting that vacancy rates for retail are higher on average than the vacancy rates for non-retail uses. Now, this might suggest that those centres that are adapting to the challenges in the retail environment, in other words, those centres which are moving from some retail floor space into leisure, culture and other uses, those centres appear to be performing better than those who have retained a larger retail floor space and may have higher retail vacancy rates. So that's one thing that's coming out across the international, metropolitan and major town centres for vacancy. Now, when we look at the rental levels between the different types of town centre in London, in the international centres in the West End, we've seen huge growth in rentals. they've outperformed almost all the other centres in London, particularly the West End. Whereas the metropolitan, major and district centres saw huge reductions in their rental levels between 2008 and 2009, and it appears that on average the districts and the major centres have recovered their rental levels back to pre-crash levels, whereas the metropolitan centres on average don't seem to have recovered as well as we might have expected. Now, again, that masks differences at centre level. So, for example, Croydon, Ealing, Kingston, Sutton, Stratford and Shepherd's Bush have all seen very strong growth in their rental levels and appear to have weathered the storm of the crash very well indeed and are performing strongly on that metric. Whereas Harrow, Romford, Ilford and Hounslow, and to some extent Wood Green, have seen reductions in their rental levels over that period. So from a purely financial performance point of view, those centres have performed less well than their counterparts that I've just mentioned. So there's a very mixed bag across the different types of centres. The next part of your question is, well, is there a difference between inner and outer London? The data at first is suggesting that the gap between the vacancy rates in the centre of London and outer London appear to be narrowing. So both inner and outer London centres, on average, have seen their vacancy rates come down by roughly about the same proportion, but they've not come down so much in central London. But I think that's partly because central London vacancy rates were much lower than those in inner and outer London. And again, masking this differences at centre level, around about 3/4 of centres in both inner and outer London have seen their vacancy rates go down, but 1/4 have seen their vacancy rates go up. So again, the importance of we'll be looking at the data at more specific centre level to identify which centres have struggled relative to others. And then in terms of the rental picture, again, central London and inner London have weathered the storm very well and have seen strong growth in their rental levels. Outer London, as an average, have not recovered their rental levels relative to the pre-2008 crash. So there is a difference there between the inner and outer London centres when we're looking at rental levels. And then finally, just to touch on whether there's been a difference between perhaps higher income areas and lower income areas. What we've done for this health check is we've identified which town centres in London overlap with the index of multiple deprivation highest 20% most deprived in England, just to give a sense as to those centres which are very close to or lie within the most deprived areas within London. Now, on average, the vacancy rates in those regeneration centres is higher than those for those centres which lie outside and perhaps in more higher income areas of London. But on average, reflecting the London-wide picture, those vacancy rates have started to fall within the regeneration centres, but they've not fallen by as much as those centres that were in the higher income areas. So there is a slight difference in the rate at which some of those centres have recovered. And then finally on rents, looking at the regeneration centres, again, rental levels tend to be much lower in those areas where the centres overlap with the index of multiple deprivation. But it does appear that, on average, those centres have recovered almost as well as those centres in the higher income areas in terms of their rental levels. But still, the rental levels are much higher in the areas of London which fall outside of the regeneration centres. So it's a very mixed picture. There's some good news in there in terms of the falling vacancy rates, but as I say, the picture will vary depending upon which town centres we look at. Now we'll be delving into this data in a lot more detail over the coming couple of months, and we'll be presenting it in a report which will be the London Town Centre Health Check, which we intend to publish as soon as we can in the autumn.
Well, thank you for that. Are we therefore, I mean, the picture from what I can see seems to be pretty optimistic, and that we seem to have from 2008 got to a situation where the decline is gradually being reversed. Yeah, that there's the true reflection.
That's right. On average,
On an
that
average,
is,
yeah.
that is true
Yeah.
to say. But as I
Yeah.
say, at different centre levels, there will be a different picture. As I say, about 3/4 of centres appear to have seen their vacancy rates fall, whereas a quarter of centres have actually seen their vacancy rates rise in the last 4 years. So there is, it's mostly good news, but there are some centres which are perhaps not adapting as well as others.
Would your report also give us borough-wide figures when it's published in autumn?
We usually go down to centre level because it's what tends to happen is at the borough level you'll be masking differences between, say, a strong performing metropolitan centre relative to a district centre or a major centre which may not be performing so well. So we will actually be analysing the data at centre level, which will give you much more fine-grained level of information.
Well, one more question. Will this report give us any idea of change in what those town centres offer in terms of mix of uses compared to what traditionally we see what town centres are?
Absolutely, and the health check data will break down into retail floor space, and we'll even be giving data on comparison goods retail versus the convenience, food-related retail and service type retail, different types of leisure functions,
Cafes and
pubs.
leisure.
And what we found on the last health check, when we looked between 2009 and 2012, was that a lot of centres were moving away from retail. So in some centres, retail was declining, but leisure was growing. So we've all witnessed it: the growth in the cafe culture, the rise in restaurants and eating out, and the leisure experience of town centres. And that was a feature in the last health check, and we'll look again this time to see if that trend has continued, and we're expecting it probably will.
Thank you. Andrew, you wanted to ask?
Well, three issues, but to pick on the one that Navin just raised with you last and then go on to the other two. You're talking about non-retail being the more growth area. Where do bookies and pawn shops and PAWN shops fit into that? Are they classed as retail or are they classed as non-retail? Because if the growth in some of the more marginal places is simply one bookie's opening after another, and I've seen that in parts of my constituency where you get 3 or 4 or 5 bookmakers in the street, which seems a bit peculiar, but that's what happens. I wouldn't necessarily class that as good growth. So when you do your breakdown, will you be sort of trying to draw a distinction between some of these different uses as well? I mean, I think they are sui generis use class.
That's correct. Yes. So the betting shops have now been removed from what was previously Class A2, which was like the estate agents and financial and professional services, and now in the sui generis use class, which means that local authorities are better able to manage applications now for betting shops to support the diversity of their areas. Within the health check, we will have separate field or information on the numbers of betting shops and floor space within town centres. We will be able to see at a centre by centre level whether there's been a trend towards an increase in betting shops since that time.
Pound shops as well?
I'm not sure if we have payday loans. I'm not sure if we have that, because there may be a difficulty in the use class around whether we'll be able to extract that data.
And pound shops in terms of heavy discount stores?
So we will have data on charity shops. I think we may have some data on discount stores. I need to double check that for you. But charity shops, we will have a separate.
Now, the next question is the timing for the monitoring of the trend. I mean, do you have a date when you're monitoring this from, or is it a period compared to a previous period? How, because obviously it's a moving feast and shops open and close all
That's
the
right,
time.
yeah.
So how are you benchmarking before and after?
So we have data going back to 2012 on that, so we'll be measuring a snapshot at 2012 with a snapshot at 2016, which is when the data will actually be
So the same data
available. That's right, yes.
Okay.
Yes, it'll be a snapshot between those two, and it'll be at centre level.
Okay, and the last question, you talked about I was just going to ask about business rates, because obviously that's a big issue in the current financial year. And if you're looking at 2016, presumably the impact of the huge increase in business rates plus the rather slow business rate relief schemes coming through will have an impact, but presumably that's not going to be reflected in your 2016 work.
No, that's right.
So,
no,
so we're going to be behind the curve a bit with that.
Yeah, we will not have information on business rates at that sort of town centre level. But we will have data on the rents, but it's only for a limited number of centres, because it's very difficult to get rents data for all of the districts. But we've got
So
it for
business
a
rates
good
is
number.
public.
Yeah, but we don't have it unfortunately.
Yeah,
in
so
the
when you next do this for 2017, is it an annual thing?
no, usually it's on a four-yearly cycle to inform the changes to the London plan.
Yeah, so the problem is we won't actually know the impact of the business rates, assuming there is an impact, until it's far too late to do anything about it, unless there's some sort of supplement to your work for 2017. You know, because that could be a major impact. I know for Oxford Street, you know, you're talking somebody's, I mean, Brett's got £1 million or something. I forget the exact figure, but it's an astronomical sum, and it's even some of the smaller shops further out are seeing huge increases as well. And unless we can actually monitor the impact of that, plus the mitigating factors such as it is of any temporary rate relief scheme, that could have a major impact on this work, which we can't do anything about until it's far too late. So is there any prospect of doing some sort of supplementary work to look at the impact of business rates?
Well, I won't make a commitment now, but what I can say is that we'll look into the potential for doing that and whether it's going to be possible for us to do it, because clearly that is a big issue
I'm just
for
listening with
businesses.
interest. Business rates are of a big concern to our members, and I've had lots of calls from ones that are just horrified at the rate of increase that some of them have been subject to, on top of all the other increases that they've received. But I don't want to interject into this because I think there's still a bit more to come.
Yeah, well, I mean, I just trying to pray you in aid to get Gerard to think about doing a bit more work on this, because otherwise the work could be completely out of date and irrelevant, because it's such a huge impact.
Absolutely, and I
On profitability.
appreciate your concerns, and I think in light of that I'll go back and we'll look into the feasibility of doing that at centre level. But I don't want to make a definite commitment now,
No.
but I'd like to just look into the
Yes.
possibility of doing it.
Andrew's point is well made on business rates, because during the whole process of new London plan, I think there will be window of opportunity given another 3 to 6 months that you can put submission in to reflect, you know, what the impact is of the business rates as they are planned to grow. Yeah, Nikki, you had a question.
Yes, I think on that last point, then you may be able to do some sampling, maybe. I think it's absolutely crucial that we actually get a much more up-to-date picture, because to have a London plan based on something that's out of date doesn't really work. So I was wondering, I don't know what other members would say, but maybe you could look at perhaps sample amongst the business improvement districts, because they have a very good handle on what business rates are doing to their areas. I'm just trying to think of ways you could do it quite quickly and that would be meaningful. Anyway, that was one thing. I don't know if other people have got other ideas for how you might do it, but Gerard, you're used to this, aren't you?
Before I bring
I
in
got one
other
more
guests,
question.
for comments, Tony, you had a question.
Can I have one more? Can I finish my? I had one more
Okay.
question. That was on the back of that last question. Where you said a quarter of all the town centres, and that's presumably across all the different kinds of town centres, we're not doing very well, right?
That's right, yes.
A quarter.
It appears
Now
to
that
be.
quarter, does it straddle? Is it mainly districts? What sort of centres are they? Mainly districts or major? What?
So It's
What kind of centres are
it
they?
spans across all of them, I think. What we've not done is looked at specifically whether it's the internationals, Mets, majors or districts, how many have increased or decreased. But it does appear that, on average, the internationals and metropolitans have fared better than
So
the
it's
districts.
more likely to be majors and districts.
It is, but as I noted from the rents data, there was a complete split between the metropolitan centres. You know, the Croydon, Stratfords, the Shepherd's Bush have performed very strongly, whereas those other centres like Ilford, Romford, Hounslow, Harrow, we'll be looking at those very closely. I can't say definitely at the moment whether those have, what impact the vacancy rate has had in those. I only have data on the rents to check for that at the moment.
And you also said that it was, on the whole, the centres that were doing less well, the quarter, were mapped according to the multiple deprivation index.
So,
Yes?
yes,
You did?
they,
Because
so
I'm
that
just
they have a
wondering.
higher vacancy rate, yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
What I'm wondering is how much there's a fit, and I'm sure there is, between the... I mean, a good town centre, well, depends. If it's international, it's a bit different, but relies on the neighbourhoods around it, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yes.
And so
Yes.
we really need to look to examine that, you know, because good growth in neighbourhoods, healthy neighbourhoods, are going to be able to support a town centre, whatever its size, better.
Absolutely, and that's critically important for the district and smaller centres. The larger centres tend to have a much bigger catchment, so they can draw in spend and tourists and other visitors from much wider areas, whereas the districts and local centres tend to depend much more on their local catchment.
But for a sustainable London, we need local centres.
Absolutely.
And so
yes.
I've always been very worried about what's going to happen to local centres, given some of the government policies. And so, I don't know, it would be good to get more information about the factors that are affecting the local centres. Because if we don't have good local centres, then we have a much less accessible, sustainable London.
That's absolutely right. And the health check will have data, but only down to the district centres. Working with the boroughs, I think there are something like 1,000 local and more neighbourhood centres, but within this strategic health check, we simply don't have the capacity or the data sets to be able to analyse those very small neighbourhood parades which provide the kind of walk-to facilities for local residents. But they are the responsibility of the boroughs, and so boroughs, in conjunction with our strategic health check, should be looking in much more detail at their local parades, their local centres, and develop policies to try to support them in that way.
So what we need to look for is whether there's a correlation between a district centre not doing very well and then perhaps the local centres around it. But that would be something for the borough to pick up on.
Exactly, the local centres, yes. That's
Yeah,
right.
okay, thanks.
Tony, before you come in, Erin wanted to...
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about some of the work we've been doing in the Regeneration team, because we've just recently commissioned a study which we're calling High Streets for All, which is a qualitative piece of research that we're doing with We Made That, who are an architecture practice, and LSE Cities. And it's quite interesting looking at the qualitative data that we've collected alongside the kind of quantitative stuff that underpins the health check. And so we chose to do a sort of deep dive to 3 high streets in London, and then to kind of zoom out and try and understand what the London story is. And as part of that work, we really wanted to understand what are the challenges that high streets are facing. And it's no surprise that, you know, the majority of the businesses reported that they were very anxious about business rates and the increases that are forecast. And what was very interesting is in the study that we did in Burnt Oak, many of the businesses that we surveyed, so we ended up speaking to over 300 businesses as part of the survey, so it's like one of the largest of its kind. And those businesses were reporting that they were struggling with rates, occupancy costs, rents. And for those reasons, it meant that keeping their business going essentially was taking all of their time. So what was interesting is that actually in those areas, in those kind of low-income areas where businesses were struggling, it meant that they found it very difficult to participate in the kind of traditional infrastructure that supports them. So, for example, business associations. So where business associations might play a role in helping them to share information between businesses, sort of pool knowledge, help with form filling, those sorts of things. Actually, that kind of social capital was missing. Part of the study, we're looking at what's the mayor's role in releasing those barriers to participation, because a lot of the time within a high street there's actually a whole wealth of knowledge that could be shared better between businesses. But just to kind of second what Gerard was saying about the diversification of retail, the other thing that we found was that a lot of those businesses are actually responding to changes in local need. And what we found was that actually, traditionally businesses that which looked, from their shop front to be a traditional shop, were actually starting to provide almost social services, things like, even things like credit to local people, informal childcare arrangements, all kinds of like very interesting kind of social offerings, which meant that there was another reason for people to visit their business. And actually it was in those areas that we found that they were more resilient, and those areas were actually able to adapt to change, because there was this, they were capitalising on this on their localness, and also had a really good understanding of what their catchment, one street back, a neighbourhood back from the high street, that actually there's a kind of, there's this ecosystem, and if businesses are able to respond to that, then then that basically means that they're able to be more resilient and sustainable. So.
Were all those 300 businesses in Byrne?
No, so it was across the 3 high streets. So it was Lewisham, Burn Oak and Upper Clapton. So those are the 3 areas.
Tony, you want to?
I would agree with both my colleagues' points. I think we just need to get focusing on where we can actually add value, which is the smaller high streets. We don't need you to look at Westfield, the West End. They've got people that do that all the time, and Savills and everybody else support those very strong retail offerings. It's really how we're going to focus on the smaller high streets, really, and understanding them before we can understand the sport. Because the general view most people have, whether this is just anecdotal, is that the smaller high streets are going to die, effectively. We all know that most of them are struggling. You're right to make the point about a destination rather than just retail. And most of them, if they're surviving, they are becoming food and drink only, or they are becoming all the other things that Andrew mentioned. And it's we need some real evidence rather than just politicians' anecdotes about this, really. And it's smaller would be my plea to you, really. I don't care what the bigger ones are doing, because I know them well and they're doing a great job and they will survive whatever happens.
So hopefully the town centre health check will help on that. Yes, we're not just monitoring the West Ends and the Stratfords and the bigger centres, although that is still important in terms of future strategic planning for London. But we're also looking at those much smaller district centres, the Palmer's Greens, the Beddingtons, the Rice, all the much smaller centres that local communities depend upon for access to goods and services. And I think they will still have a retail role in the future, but that will be part of a much broader mix of uses. And I think those centres that are able to adapt to find new uses on the high street, new commercial uses, will be able to adapt and thrive in the longer term. But it will be a challenge, and it will be a particular challenge for some of those smaller centres within
really optimistic. I can see even ones in Westminster, the ones that aren't the prime ones, are struggling, and parts of them being turned into resi. I think you're being very, very optimistic. I hope you're right.
Okay, if we can leave it at that for now. Do any of the other members? Mark has indicated he wants to come in.
A few things. The shopping price, local district centres, Harrow, I'm from Harrow Council, we do collect the sort of data that you're looking for. It's interesting because our picture is different probably from yours. Our local centres have been more resilient than the town centre. The shopping offer has changed, but it's not just been sort of food and drink. It's also been in the context of leisure, I'm talking about gyms, also a lot of healthcare, laser surgeries, beauticians. And the other thing that they do offer, I mean, I'm quite a fan of low rent levels because they do offer opportunities for entry into the market. And entry into the market in areas where you can't go off and buy something online. You know, we've got an Afghan bakery and I can't buy Afghan bread online. You know, but they're responsive to newer communities, but almost you do need to try and depress cost of entry. So it's not just business rates, which is an issue, but it is rent levels, and you don't necessarily want your regeneration to actually increase rent levels to a stage where actually you can't get new entrants into the market. I think that's really important. The other thing, just to, you know, when I looked at my sort of notes as I was listening to you, two things that you didn't mention. One related to the loss of office use, which isn't just an impact upon metropolitan town centres, but some of our district centres, you know, like Pinner and Stanmore, are dependent upon offices. And, you know, all the stats that we've got, the percentage of occupied office use was going up and up, up, up like that over the last 10 years. 2016, bang, suddenly it stopped. And I talk about the percentage of occupied space, because vacant space it's interesting when you talk about vacant space, but actually, if you look at the percentage of occupied space, it gives you a different picture, because your vacancies may be shrinking because you've actually got a smaller retail base, or your vacancies may be shrinking because you've got a smaller office space. So just looking at vacancy doesn't tell you the whole picture. You need to look at the quantum of space that you've got and how that's filled. The other thing that you didn't pick up, and for me, when I'm not just in Harrow, when I've looked around other town centres, is the BHS effect. The impact on BHS in our area, 6,000 or 6,500 square metres, is equivalent to 300 jobs. That store's been empty for about whenever they closed, which was 18 months ago. I can't even remember when they closed. But everywhere I've been, well, not many places, but St Albans, Norwich, Harrow, anyway, those BHS stores are empty, and they've a significant impact actually on vacancy rates. And I think you need to factor in sometimes the impact of big chain closures. We're fortunate that one's going to be filled within 6 months or so. But so there are some additional things that I think that you should be considering. And we would be more than happy to share data with you on district centres.
Just to respond to that, Chair, the Town Centre Health Check will have analysis on the impact of office to residential community development rights at town centre level. We just don't have the data to be able to share with you today, but we will be looking at that very specific issue.
Okay, Denise, you wanted to come in.
Well, the other people have made some extremely good points, and obviously the social value of small businesses in any community is something I think that's widely recognised, but underneath all of that, you've got to remember that the whole point of being a business, whether it's a shop or an office or any small business operating and providing possibly jobs, is that they should make a profit. And the reality of facts for small businesses right across London over the last 2 to 3 years has been against a backdrop of rising costs. We have had calls from members whose rentals have gone up by 30, 40, sometimes even doubled. This is against a backdrop as well of rising employment costs. On average, our research shows that every small business has had an average of £2,500 additional employment costs because of government policy and regulation. And those include auto-enrolment pensions, that includes increases to minimum wage and the introduction of living wage. Now, obviously, that's quite a sort of broad statement, and different sectors have responded and been affected in different ways. But certainly for those sectors that run small businesses in a given area that are with very small margins, and the retail sector is actually falling more and more into that, particularly at the smaller end, they have been less able to weather those cost increases, and they are really, really struggling. And then your comment about the rates revaluation has had a significant impact as well. We are currently undertaking research at the moment to look into that impact and also how London actually relates to the rest of the UK. sorry, I don't have any results to share with you today, but we will be releasing that in due course when they're available. The other thing I wanted to point out as well, that small businesses are extremely adaptable, and I actually am quite optimistic that small businesses will always be there, because exactly as has been said by other panellists, the entry into business as a way of providing a livelihood, particularly for certain cultural groups, is actually still a very valid one for many sections of London's diverse community. We do need to make sure, though, that those costs of entry are kept proportional, and I think that's another aspect of the business rates situation, because it's actually putting an increasing burden of cost on those businesses operating with commercial premises, particularly on our high streets, as having to find a greater contribution to the pot. So those are the sort of points I just wanted to make.
Can I just start?
Sorry. Can we just hear from panelists and then you can come back? John, you wanted to come in.
It's just really to support the rest of the panel, if nothing else. The biggest challenge I know is diversifying the sectors, particularly in Haven and Romford. It's a major problem we have, because the gap that's growing with the decline in retail, which nationally is masked by the strength of e-commerce, which is growing about 15% year on year. What we're finding is that the cost and the value of the spaces that we have that really want to be grown in terms of leisure, where there is significant growth, can't be achieved because the rents are too high. That added to the shrinkage in office sector space, as Mark pointed out, is actually a significant problem. And I think you tend to find that a lot of local governments particularly still have outdated thinking in terms of trying to secure and protect retail, when in fact encouraging 18-hour leisure growth is actually kind of where the opportunity lies. But I think there's a significant imbalance in terms of the value of the properties and the accessibility of those businesses in. In the smaller centres, what we're seeing is quite a growth in social enterprise, and I think that's an area that we really need to encourage as well, where it's not just purely commercial, it's about engaging with communities, and that's where we're trying to show as much support as we possibly can, because that's where the smaller district centres can still offer both convenience but also offer engaging activities as well. And again, in terms of resilient, we appear to be relatively resilient in Romford as a metropolitan centre, but I think things like BHS and those elements we're just going to start to see over the next 3 or 4 years, alongside with the business rate shift and change. Our town centre is actually going to start to both shrink and actually not be as economically strong as it has been for a while, which will have residual impact on the district centres as well, because it's a central point for quite a large proportion of our community. So it's just really to support a lot of things that have been said along the panel. Really.
Erin.
I was just going to go back to your point about the necessity of looking at local centres and that kind of, the shops that you can walk to, the parades that are in every Londoner has their own high street essentially. And I think in a way it's interesting that the title of today's discussion is around town centres, because in a way what's missing from that is high streets, because so often when you look at the boundary of a town centre, actually it takes in a high street, and there are also these interstitial frontages that that travel between town centres and actually have a lot of local value, and that Londoners rely on. So some of the work that we've been doing as a result of the High Streets for All study is looking at the potential for when you're thinking when boroughs are doing their local plan or thinking about a strategy for town centres, that also takes into account high streets, and that the language isn't just about town centres, it's also about those kinds of those interstitial frontages and parades that so many people rely on, and actually they because of their innate accessibility, they also encourage active transport. So you can walk to them, you can cycle to them, you don't need to get on a bus, you don't need to drive necessarily. So in a way, looking at that on that local level is going to be so important for London's environmental future as well.
Tony, you wanted to... Okay, Andrew.
Yeah, a couple of things. I was going to come back to the thing that Erin mentioned about the missing social capital, and the fact that people don't have time to engage in business associations. And if I compare and contrast, say, Camden Town, Camden Town Business Improvement District is very effective.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it works because there's sufficient large businesses to fund it. The small shops don't have to pay anything, but you get the benefit from it, and that's a very effective organisation with a very dynamic leader. Contrast that with, say, Edgware, where there is a town team, and whenever I go to a meeting, they're all very depressed, they can't do anything about it, they don't feel they're getting support from anybody.
Yeah.
They do turn up, and there's a meeting coming up soon, and I suspect it'll be much the same as any of the other ones. And that's where they have tried to come together, but they just don't feel they've got the support or knowledge or experience or expertise they need to try and move things on.
Yeah.
Plus a resistance to change. So a lot of the shops are rather outdated and outmoded, but shopkeepers are somewhat resistant to change. And then you contrast that with again, the third one I've put into that is Burnt Oak, where there's just absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
And I can't see there being anything because there just isn't the resource there to support it.
Yeah.
And I think part of it is how can we find a way of capitalising, say, on the Edgware where people do want to do something but just don't know how to go around doing it, or don't feel they get the support from the council or anybody else for that matter, and the Burnt Oak one where there's just nothing.
Yeah.
And I think part of that also may be where people live, because a lot of the shopkeepers now don't live in the areas where their shops are. So if it's a question of locking up the shop and then coming back for a meeting after training or whatever, they're not going to do it.
Yeah, I mean, just to respond to that, that you know, what the story you've just described is exactly what we've witnessed, and I think, I mean, there's two things in a way. You know, one is the role of boroughs. You know, boroughs, you know, like Harrow play a really important role in high street stewardship, and so, you know, it's so important that that town centres within a borough can learn from each other in a way. So if there are town centres where they have managed to, you know, create a good governance structure and, you know, are having innovative ideas about how to address some of these issues, then, you know, part of the role of the borough is to, you know, to make sure that those lessons learned are being shared. But I do also think, looking at the Camden precedent, you know, the role of the private sector, particularly bids, and, you know, a kind of mentoring potentially, because in those smaller centres you don't necessarily have the large retail providers, the chain shops, who might come with more experience or more resource in order to attend those kinds of meetings and be part of those sorts of organisations. So if bids could potentially work across borough boundaries.
I tried that.
Oh, you tried that.
It didn't really get anywhere because, again, it comes down to critical mass. I mean, the Camden one works because you've got sufficient big businesses who put their hands in the pockets.
So there's this cross.
If you don't have those big businesses to help fund it, as in Edgware or Burnt Oak, it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
I mean, there's also thinking about, because we do a lot of work with Team London at the GLA, for example, and you know, sometimes you have people living within the catchment area who work for bigger businesses. So it's not necessarily their professional role on the high street, but it's their, you know, trying to tap into the professional capital or the social capital within an area, and, you know, make that, you know, drawing on that, so that it's not just, you know, thinking about traditional business associations, but also stewardship in terms of kind of citizen-led regeneration. But at the same time, it is very difficult, especially with, you know, the kind of the receding of the state. You know,
well, that was the next point I was going to come to, which is the social capital, where, because of the pressure on local authority budgets, we've seen the libraries close, we've seen the local service offices close, all of which are usually in or near the high street / town centre.
Yeah.
And so there's less, you know, you can't go to the council library to borrow books, so that's one reason fewer to go to the town centre. The council offices closed down where you used to go and pay your rent or your parking fines or whatever. It's all done online, and now you can't. Another reason not to go to the town centre. And so it goes on. So, and it's not just the council, it's public services generally are withdrawing, and that again reduces the demand to actually go to these places. And if you go to the town centre for the library, you may well go to a coffee shop or other retail.
Well, I think, I mean, I think we're going to move on to talk about the Good Growth Fund, so I can talk a bit about that. But just in terms of Crowdfund London, which is the Mayor's crowdfunding programme, We've done 2 other rounds of crowdfunding, and we've done a lot to try and learn those lessons from those previous rounds. And what we realise is you really need to do a lot of capacity building.
Yeah, I think I asked you about this before, didn't I? And the concentration in certain boroughs and virtually none in elsewhere, for example. I don't know.
What with crowdfunding?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what we've done this time is, rather than using the pot of funding that we have available to focus on projects, we've actually held back a portion of the money in order to do capacity building. So this time round, we've done a lot more work around trying to help people grow their ideas, so that it's more of a level playing field. You're not just getting ideas from the places where people are well organised and have the time and resource to set up citizen-led regeneration projects. But in turn that takes resource as well. So I guess to do inclusive regeneration, it's about just deciding how to get the most out of the funding that you do have, and making sure that you do have the resource in place to make sure that these sorts of systems can work.
I'm just going to take one more contribution in response to Andrew's
It was really in response to Andrew's comment about businesses that don't want to make any adjustments, amendments, upgrades or anything like that. I don't think it's always such a simple point that they don't want to. They may have restrictions, they may have terms in their leases. Some leases for rental properties, they're actually responsible for the full maintenance as well as everything else that goes on. So their pots spread very thinly. And I think you do need to look at some of the reasons behind why they're not doing that, and they may be restricted. So.
Right. Tony, you have a couple of questions on good growth.
My first question is to Erin. Obviously, good growth was launched recently. What is good growth, and how would you define it, please?
So it certainly is Good Growth Week, isn't it? That's what you just pointed out earlier on. So the Mayor did a speech last night at LSE Cities talking about good growth. And we just launched our Good Growth by Design programme, and previously we've also just launched our Good Growth Fund. So good growth is everywhere. I guess, at the heart of it, London is growing, and London needs to adapt and change in order to meet the needs of Londoners. And good growth is about making London a city that works for everybody, so that London can grow in a way that's more equitable. And I guess, central to that, it's about making sure that people are able to share in London's prosperity. It's about making sure that growth is responsive to places and the kind of, the local distinctiveness and character of those places. And an intrinsic part of that is high quality design. But it's also about the point we touched on earlier about environmental sustainability and social capital, and making sure that growth draws on the skills of Londoners, and that Londoners are able to participate in growth, in the benefits of growth.
So could the question really, I guess I should have also asked, is how is it different from previous regeneration programmes? Can you give me a specific example?
Yeah,
what
sure.
would be different from now?
So as part of kind of what I just mentioned, like a big part of that is about social inclusion and the kind of thinking about the social impact of regeneration. And so, we've been really keen to this time round, because this is, we've done at least 4 previous funding rounds, so we've been really keen to kind of learn from previous funding rounds, and we're really keen to lower the barriers to entry. And so I guess it comes back to something we've also touched on is, sometimes there may be a really good idea, but it needs some development in order for it to turn into a great regeneration project. So what we've done is we've introduced an EOI stage, so an expression of interest stage, so that the actual process of applying is easier. You just have to set out in very simple terms what your idea is. And then what we've developed is what we're calling a triage process, so that once we've got in all of those ideas, we can then decide, yep, they're ready to go, we can support them, and they can get into delivery very quickly. But then there are some others that where potentially there are resources that are lacking, or there's a great idea but it needs development. And so then what we've done with the Good Growth Fund this time round is, as I said, with Crowdfund London, we've kept back a proportion of our funding in order to develop those projects in collaboration with the delivery partners. And We've also changed our process to be an online process, and done a lot of work to kind of simplify the language and simplify the process itself for applications.
Sorry, that's all your end. That's all the processes in this building. What's in London? What's the difference going to be between the previous regen programmes under the previous mayor and this one under Good Growth?
So as I was saying, a lot of it is to do with how we measure the impact that we're making. Previously, our outputs have been quite simplistic, relating to counting jobs. We were even counting how many trees we planted, how many square metres of public realm improved, those sorts of things. But this time round, we're much more interested in the social impact of our programmes, and also participation. So how the projects we invest in are getting Londoners involved and can evidence that. And even as part of the Good Growth Fund, we were potentially developing something which we're at the moment just calling a challenge fund, but basically calling for ideas about how we can do evaluation in a way that's more meaningful, so that we can actually demonstrate the environmental, social and economic impact of our projects. So we're moving towards a more evidence-based approach to regeneration, so that we can make sure that there is a more equitable sharing in the benefits. I guess the other point, which is more specifically on process, but the idea is that we take more of a rolling approach, so that rather than projects having to fit in with slightly obscure GLA-based deadlines, we're able to plan and develop projects over the next 4 years, so that it's not so much about quick wins, it's more about long-term relationships and partnering, because we talk a lot about scale in our team. Sometimes it's about a locally based project on a small scale, and sometimes it's about holistic change in an area, and so both of those things take time, and I think we want to be cognizant of that and make sure that we're not just choosing oven-ready projects that can deliver very tangible outputs quickly. It's more about the longer-term outcomes that relate to good growth.
Thank you.
Any questions? No. Okay. Nikki.
Yes. This is more about the planning side of this, but what are the lessons that we've learned from previous regeneration projects and previous funding for regeneration projects, and how are they going to? It's really how are they now going to inform the new London plan? So I don't know who to ask. Well, ask the GLA.
I guess we can jointly answer that.
Yeah. I mean, I think as Erin was stating around this kind of idea of good growth around the London plan, one of the things we're looking at is how we can embed some of these principles in the London plan as we go forward. So it's around spreading the benefits of regeneration across all parts of London. I think there's sometimes been a criticism in the past that things have focused very much on the centre of London. But I think one of the things that we want to do as part of this work, and as we're working towards the London plan, is to look to ways to spread those benefits much more wider across London, and that will have implications for supporting growth in town centres, but as well as supporting our industrial areas and other employment areas throughout the capital, around also improving access to opportunities. So there's a lot of other piece of work around skills and removing barriers to employment and progression, supporting apprenticeships. So there's a whole range of other kind of aspects which I think we're now driving forward as part of our preparation for the London plan, and indeed some of the other mayoral strategies.
What have you particularly learned from, I mean, it overlaps a bit with the last question, what have you particularly learned from the regeneration funding that you've given, and how will, does any of that need to be reflected in the London plan?
I think one of the things that we want to bring out more strongly in the new London plan We currently have a policy around the regeneration areas, the areas for regeneration, which are focused on at the moment, the 20% most deprived areas within London. But because London has greater levels of need for regeneration than the rest of the country, we're now looking at it potentially expanding that to take into account the 20% most deprived neighbourhoods within England, because there are actually more, because of London has greater levels of need for regeneration than the rest of the country, there are actually more areas in London where there are particular needs for regeneration. So I think we want to strengthen that policy, and that, I hope, will also help guide our work, looking at funding in terms of where we can target regeneration resources to have the maximum impact on those areas which are, by our work looking at the index, some of the most in need of regeneration across the country, but also looking at more finer-grained work at the local level, because the index of multiple deprivation varies depending upon which indicator you look at. If you look at incomes, if you look at community safety, if you look at education, the map of the areas which are in need of regeneration changes slightly as you look at those different elements of the broader index. And so with our work with our colleagues in Regeneration team, but also with Transport for London, who are looking at this very closely as well, we can look at how we can better integrate our planning, but also the specific regeneration improvements within different parts of London. So that's an area of policy that we're
going to
strengthen.
just policy. Does that mean you're going to actually have, you talked about these very, very deprived areas. Does that mean you're going to have special, zonal approaches to those?
Well, I think as we have in the current plan, there's reference to areas for regeneration where we encourage boroughs to develop more integrated approaches to support the improvements of those areas. So I think what we want to do in the new plan is to strengthen that policy, pick up the links with development in the opportunity areas to try to better link in the new developments in the opportunity areas to benefit the communities which are within those areas which are some of the most deprived, but also to make the link more strongly with the town centres as well that overlap those areas in terms of the link that those centres can play in supporting access to opportunities and services for residents living within those locations.
It's very difficult to deal. We're dealing with such a vast strategic canvas. Can you give an example?
So,
for instance, this very deprived area will benefit from there being an opportunity area around it or near it. I mean, just a segue for a minute. Are these very deprived areas overlapping with areas of opportunity areas?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I
okay,
think
so then that you mentioned,
yes.
So they're within the opportunity areas.
Right,
and then how will they benefit? Is there a neighbourhood town centre or nearby town centre? Can you give us one example?
So the example, like the Upper Lee Valley and Thames Gateway, throughout the whole of those areas, there is a very strong link between areas which are some of the most in need of regeneration in the country, linked with those areas also being within opportunity areas. So like Barking, areas within Newham, Canning Town, East Ham, the areas which lie within those kind of broad opportunity areas, but also in need of regeneration. So not only will those areas benefit from new housing and new affordable housing, access to new jobs and employment coming into those areas, but they will also be potentially benefiting from improvements to the public transport infrastructure, which is being planned to link with those new development areas. That will also benefit the existing residents in those areas, not only bringing in opportunities for jobs and new homes, but also improving access to the wider labour market in London and wider opportunities across the capital.
How will you make sure that a lot of the, we talked earlier, somebody was talking about the importance of low rents, low entry, the importance of low entry thresholds and the importance of that sort of ecosystem. How are you going to preserve that in the face of what is called good growth, but may actually not always be good for some of these uses.
I mean, that's a huge challenge, and I think one of the ways that the Mayor's been clear in the City for All Londoners, he wants to do more work to ensure that there's sufficient workspace, so ensuring that there's enough supply of workspace, which by definition should help to keep some of the rents down in some of the more in some locations within London. But also we're looking quite closely at policy around trying to ensure there's sufficient supply of low-cost workspace, which is workspace which is not necessarily subsidised. I'll come on to the affordable workspace in just a moment. But this is kind of workspace which, so it's not subsidised anyway, it's just the fact that it's maybe by virtue of its specification or its location, so it might be within an industrial area where rents tend to be lower than they are in town centres or in central London, or it could be back of High Street, the sort of places that Erin was talking about earlier where they're not on the prime frontage, so the rents tend to be slightly lower at the back of the High Street, or in some of the more peripheral areas of what are the core town centres. So not in the sort of the prime retail area, they might be in the secondary or tertiary areas where the rental levels start to drop off. And those areas provide great opportunities for businesses, new startups to find new space at levels which are much lower than the prime rents that are in the town centres. Now in some parts of London, and we're thinking in particular like in areas around the city fringe, that there are going to be cost pressures on business space, which notwithstanding all those things I've just mentioned, are going to put a lot of pressure on businesses and opportunities to find new space. So we are exploring as part of our work now as we're developing policy for the new London plan, which we'll be bringing out in the autumn, about whether there might be certain circumstances where it might be desirable to require affordable workspace, which is where there's some form of cross-subsidy through the business development, where some of the space is kept at below market level rents for a certain period of time, and that gives an opportunity for cultural uses, for social enterprises or other enterprises where there's some broader kind of regeneration benefit for start-up businesses to take advantage of some of that space.
Just as we used to require 50% of all, it was an aspiration to begin with and then a target, 50% of all new mixed-use developments, we say, if they had a it's just an analogy this, if they had a residential element, had to have some affordable housing. You're now saying that in those areas where growth is actually going to drive out, well it will, we know it will, in many areas of London, I get letters, it's happening, growth drives out some of the ecosystem which we've been talking about up till now as being very important. You're saying that you have to accept that, but on the other hand, we will be able to sort of have some kind of planning policy which says we want affordable workspace. You, the developer, are getting whatever you want, but we want X amount of affordable workspace out of it. Is that what you're saying?
There are two things. First of all, we want to make sure that in those areas that new business space is provided as part of development. We're not going to put a specific X% on what that will vary in each given case. We want to make sure that development proposals for mixed-use development are providing both new additional housing, but also providing some commercial space in those mixed-use areas. But where there are specific issues around the affordability of that space, then there may be certain circumstances where it's appropriate to seek some affordable workspace where there is some level of subsidy, but subject to the overall viability. And clearly, one of the issues is going to be around the balance between meeting the Mayor's objectives around affordable housing, but also transport. So it will be weighed amongst all the different planning objectives, which is why I think our initial thinking as officers and working with the Mayor's team is that the affordable workspace, the subsidised workspace, would not be a blanket requirement across all types of space, but could just be required in certain circumstances where there are particular cost pressures, where there's, as you mentioned, that risk of businesses that contribute to the character of the area, thinking around, you know, the culture and the city fringe and all those types of areas, that there may be in some circumstances we might want to look for affordable workspace as part of the scheme, but probably not a blanket requirement.
I'm getting letters, you know, about Hackney Wick, for instance, Albert Island, you know, those areas where in fact development pressures are actually really threatening, and they're our, you know, GLA development pressures, threatening the existing uses. And some of these are small businesses, some are creatives. They're not meanwhile uses. I'm just wondering. So will this be grant funding? Will this be how the regeneration funds might be used?
So it's, I mean, the affordable workspace could be either by a benevolent developer or by a landowner or a trust, or it could be secured through a Section 106 planning application. That's one of the routes in which it could be secured, and there are examples like, for example, Hackney and Islington currently running policies at the moment around securing a proportion of affordable workspace on certain commercial schemes to secure that affordable workspace within their area for a time period. Yeah.
Well, I think that time period will be critical, because if it is a short period, it's not going to work, because the biggest problem is affordability, and how do you sustain that use over a much longer period. That's generally the problem with artist studios and similar sort of cultural artistic sort of offers. Denise has been waiting patiently to comment on issues raised by Nikki. So Denise.
I think there's an awful lot of emphasis on startups, and yes, we do need to make sure that there is opportunity for new businesses to enter, etc. But I don't think we need to lose sight of the existing and established businesses in an area, particularly if you're looking for good growth. Growth is actually about starting a business and building a sustainable business that will continue to benefit the community in years to come. And the biggest hump for most small businesses is when they go from that startup phase, possibly take on their very first member of staff. But actually, when you get to the 2 to 3 year stage, that's when a lot of business deaths actually occur, because they suddenly find that the lease that they've got initially has reached its end of its discount period or preferential period, or it may be that the lease owners just actually want to make sure it's always occupied by a startup, and suddenly they then are considered an established business and then have to sort of go out into the wild west that is finding property for a growing small business. Now, small businesses like the quirky spaces, they will go to the ones that aren't sort of shiny steel and glass necessarily. I've got one member that has moved 3 times, I think, now in the last 5 years. She runs a theatre company. She's giving subcontracted work to 50 or more out-of-work actors that actually give them an ability to develop their crafts. But she's running a business, but she has props, she has costumes, she needs space. And every time she's found somewhere that's suitable, she's got it on a short-term lease and has to go through all the pain of moving every time. Sustaining her business is quite a battle. And then, of course, added into that, which I know we're going to come on to later, but the permitted development rights issue is also a big concern, and I would like to explore that at some point this morning. I don't know if now is the right time to bring that up.
To move on to that,
Andrew
okay.
wanted to raise that issue, so you can come in on that later on. Mark, were you indicating?
Yeah, I suppose a couple of things. But we have used the planning process to create workspace, and we've had a mix of starter incubator space, move on space, then move on again on a housing-led development. We've also used the planning process to create space for creative and media use. However, within there, just designating something for a particular use doesn't mean that it's actually affordable. So we did use some regeneration money actually to leverage capital funding from the GLA to produce rent subsidies for artist space. But for me, the critical issue is that it's not just about cheap space. It's also about revenue funding for ongoing business support. I mean, one of the projects that we ran, which was really successful, wasn't just about giving someone space to test their ideas from high street premises. Without a doubt, the feedback, all of those businesses would have failed if they hadn't got someone holding their hand and actually giving us advice around access to finance and financial management, market research and sales and marketing. So these are very much sort of entry level, Denise. But without that support, they would have failed. So cheap space by itself, and I would say cheap space, I'm not a great fan of, unless it's linked up with almost incubation where you're giving some ongoing support as well. But we can certainly use our planning process to help create space, but by itself it could be vacant, or you could just have the same people parked there for 10 years or 15 years and not allowing a churn of people to move.
Andrew, you want to?
Yeah, well, just coming on to limited development rights, which I think Denise wanted to talk about as well. We've seen this huge, particularly office switch to residential. One area I know best is, in this respect, is Edgware, but it's also happening elsewhere in Barnet too, and also in Camden. And to my mind, the impact is also in the customers that would use the local businesses as well, because you've got a lot of people working in these premises who'll use the local shops, you know, sandwich shops or whatever during the lunchtime, and then go. When they're replaced by residential, it seems to me that the sort of people who are moving into these places are using it as a dormitory and are not really using the local businesses in the way that they did before. Plus, you've got the loss of the support network for the retail as well. You're using the accountants and the lawyers and all those people who provide the backup to the small businesses as well. I don't know. Those are issues you want to raise, or the other ones as well?
Well, our sort of research has shown that about 38% of businesses that were converted to residential were actually fully occupied at the time that they were converted. So there's a lot of businesses that were kicked out, and 18% of them were part occupied. We estimate there's been a cost of about 2,500 jobs by doing that. One example, Carlo House in Camden, you mentioned Camden. That Carlo House had creative and techs startups, and there was about 500 employees based in with all those businesses there. Each of those employees had about £70 to £80 per week discretionary spend in the local area with the local businesses, which just, you know, doing the simple maths gives you a loss of £40,000 per week to the Camden High Street area. And it's these knock-on effects. So the FSB would actually like to see some changes to a new policy brought in, that any current B1A office or B1C light industrial space must not be converted if it has more than 20% occupancy. The permitted development rights was brought in with good intentions to bring back into use derelict and unused buildings, but for all sorts of reasons it's been a little bit of a developer's charter, and there have been some tactics by landowners, landlords, to actually remove small businesses from their premises, even though they were viable, established family businesses.
Well, certainly saw this in Edgware with Premier House, where I think about 130 businesses, charities, what have you, fully occupied, all kicked out for a conversion. I think the other problem with permitted development rights is they don't even have to provide a proportion of affordable accommodation like any normal planning application would have to do. And also in that one, the local council's environmental health people said they would not have advised giving it permission because of the environmental aspects of it as well. So it is a serious impact. And partly, I think, is whether or not the local council applied for the exemption and whether those exemptions are going to be sustainable. Barnet didn't, Camden did for part of it, but couldn't get the whole thing. And I think that the point you make is it's a good thing if you're going to bring in long derelict, abandoned property, which may be the case in other parts of the country, but in London it's had this appalling effect, particularly in outer London.
Yes.
And is impacting on local economies, yet the government seems utterly impervious to the argument. So, Gerard, you want to...
Absolutely, yes, and just we've just published in the London Office Policy Review some evidence and quite an interesting map which shows the impact of office to residential permitted development rights across London, so particularly affecting those areas in and around the central activity zone, where just outside the zone where they're not exempt from the rights, but also quite strikingly across town centres across London, mostly west and south of London, but also to some extent in the north and east of London as well. So yes, we're seeing, as far as the prior approvals are concerned, a significant potential impact, and as we were talking about earlier, that will have a knock-on impact on the vitality and viability of those centres.
What are you doing about it? Is it, you know, we produce reports, we've got the data. How is that being presented to government, and are government actually listening to any of this?
Well, we've had several meetings with CLG, highlighting some of the concerns and our monitoring work that we've done very closely with the London boroughs, drawing attention to all the disadvantages around, you know, the lack of, you know, no requirement for affordable housing and all the other standards of environmental standards in which those developments are delivered, and also the impact on jobs. But it does seem that our government colleagues are very intent on the numbers. The numbers seem to be what counts in terms of the number of units which are being delivered as part of the Office to Residential Permitted Development Rights. So what we're trying to do in our discussions with government is to take a tack. Well, the government are interested in the numbers for housing, it appears. And we're also interested in the numbers, but also the quality and affordability of those housing units. So rather than converting poor quality or occupied even offices into residential, it would be better to manage that through the planning system, through redevelopment, to actually deliver some replacement business space if necessary, so we're not losing the business space, but we're also delivering significantly more houses through greater intensification, better formatting of developments. We actually deliver more houses, better quality houses, more affordable houses, but we're not losing the business space if we do it as part of mixed-use development. And we've been trying to promote this approach that permitted development rights doesn't work for London, because we can actually deliver better outcomes, not just the outcomes that we've been talking about, but also meeting the outcomes that the government are interested in, which are seems to be the numbers of units.
Are they listening?
It seems not at this stage.
Yeah,
it seems not at this stage. Yeah, but we are, you know, doing everything we can, and we're working with the boroughs as well to support them with evidence where we can, and to encourage them to bring forward the Article 4 directions which remove the permitted development rights, and a number of boroughs have done so and have managed to at least try to safeguard some of their key town centres and their key kind of office locations. And for those boroughs that have not yet done so, we would still urge them to do so in light of the evidence that we've just published.
Is that option still open? I thought they'd been closed down now for those that hadn't bothered.
No, the option is still open for boroughs to bring forward Article 4 directions, and indeed for the central London boroughs, Tech City, Hackney, Tower Hamlets, Islington, the Northern Isle of Dogs, which are currently exempt from permitted development rights until May 2019. We're now going to be working with those boroughs to ensure that they will bring forward Article 4 directions for those locations, to ensure that those nationally significant offices are safeguarded when the exemptions expire in 2019.
Gerard, do you think there's a stronger case for areas which are defined as opportunity or intensification areas, where if you made or if you applied for Article 4, that you're more likely to be successful?
I think our feedback so far from the attempts that boroughs have made is that obviously the borough-wide approaches, and even very significant, like for example, like the Camden case highlighted that even quite extensive areas were not particularly successful when they went to the government. But where they're very geographically focused, particularly on town centres and sort of core office areas, I think there was some acceptance where there's good local evidence to justify those Article 4s, and those do appear to have been successful.
Johnny and Mark, what's your experience on that? Have you tried to venture through Article 4 direction, or what's your experience on PD rights?
With us, obviously we've got a core office sector within the metropolitan centre of Romford, and the other thing that we have an impact is the talent drain from the city. Being so close to the financial area, we're losing talent and we're obviously losing space as well. It's been converted to residential. I think we can learn from places outside of the city. Birmingham Cornwall Business District, their strategy was incredibly strong, where they had a very specific business improvement district for their financial centre, but they also actively encourage leisure into their business area, which equals significant retention of the businesses within that area, because it offers a full-rounded experience for people who work there and live there. The problem is, as Gerard's rightly said, this isn't really suitable for particularly outer London boroughs or for central London, because there's better ways of approaching mixed-use development, encouraging a balance within the area. It's a significant issue that has been raised by most of the business community in Romford particularly. And outside of that, again, it's a common conversation.
Do you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, my work in planning, my understanding though is that 1,000 or so housing units have been created through permitted development. There's been a huge loss of sort of daytime economy. I mean, our estimates are around 65 million per annum. There's been a net loss in jobs. It was more than 20% of those businesses that were occupied. I mean, this is occupied space that we're talking about. I think that we did look for Article 4 but weren't successful, and everything that you've said, Gerard, around being able to intensify space far better through development and re-provide office accommodation or other workspace accommodation as well as better quality housing is appropriate. We've also lost SEAL. I mean, there is a fear that some of these places are going to be the slums of the future because of poor quality housing. None of them address housing needs. We've got a big housing need for larger families. We've got high density levels, and the units that have been built through affordable housing, through permitted development, don't address any of those needs at all. So, we'll sort of welcome any support that you're giving, and we'd sort of be behind you or in front of you.
Liz, you were waiting
I just wanted to make the point that it's brilliant that there are policies being sort of proposed that actually make sure that the amount of commercial space, office space is actually protected. But in the drive to do those development deals, please don't kick out the established businesses, because when a business has actually failed, it's usually been secured by personal lending from the owner. They may have actually secured their business lending by their homes. So if that business fails, it's a tragedy to that particular family because it affects everybody. And it's not just about retaining the amount of space available, it's actually about retaining the business, is not just the business space. So whatever policies that are developed need to make proper provision for continuity of existing businesses when those new developments are proposed by boroughs, and not lose sight of it. Sure, London does have a higher turnover of business. It's a very competitive environment, but we don't need to have policies that exacerbate that any more than it is. And we need to be looking after good, established, traditional family businesses that are employing people, filling social needs, and providing a community cohesion and value that you don't get from the much bigger organisations.
Right. Yeah, Nick.
That was actually what Denise just said, was a bit what I was trying to emphasise earlier, which is that, when businesses are, I mean, I didn't just mean the very sort of early entry ones, the sort of startups, but businesses are sometimes, in the name of growth and good growth, not able to stay where they are. And, it's how we look after that, which is what you're talking about. And whether, in fact, there can't be another way of doing it. But I wanted to ask about your point about 20% being the point you made, Denise, about, and it was about light industry as well as...
Yes, it's not just about office space, because the actual light industrial can include, all sorts of things. It could be, I'm thinking off the top of my head, it could be somebody that actually has some sort of textile business. It could be somebody that's doing picture framing. you know, they are perceived as retail outlets, but they do have an activity that actually is more than just sales. So those sorts of businesses don't impact in local neighbourhoods. They don't tend to make a lot of noise, but they are another additional type of business that needs to also be included in this. And as I say, if often in those old factory units that have got lots of little units in now that have got lots of small businesses in, you do get a massive variety, and it can be from the tech business, it can be, you know, right the way through up to the coffee maker, it can be the marketing agency. There are lots of things. One of our members is in PR, but they also produce the banners and the actual materials that actually wrap around things when they're actually doing the marketing and the merchandising that goes with all of that sort of activity. So technically, they're manufacturers as well as professional agencies.
So let me just ask you this, because in October, the the permitted development for light industry is coming in. You know, exactly what we've seen for offices is being introduced for light industry. And I just want to clarify, are you saying then that this, I mean, I was very aware that makers are light industry, but you're saying there's some hybrid services.
This is the nature of small businesses, that they often cross a lot of these nice little pigeonholes, and this is actually
so how are they classified then? Are they are they classified as light industry, or are they classified as offices? Gerard might know.
I'm really sorry, but I can't answer that technical question. I defer to
there's a blurring between the use classes order in this sense. They've got the B1A offices versus the B1C light industrial, so there may be some type of manufacturing or production process within a light industrial business, but where that can carry out without detriment to the amenity of residential areas, it's classified as light industry. So it could be the maker spaces, you know, the furniture, the fashion, textile designers.
Similar use classes
even
within the
food preparation.
Anyway, either way, they're going to be clobbered now.
Yeah.
Because
that's
of
right. That's why we're calling for to make sure they don't.
Now you're calling, I mean, and I can understand it, 20% should be occupied with offices. I'm not so sure about that for light industry, because a lot of what I understand as light industry, a lot of it is very, very small, like 2, 3, 4 people in a single premise and so on. I mean, why can't we just say they shouldn't be unoccupied? I mean, why have we got to go for this 20%?
Well, the reason we've done that is we actually understand that there's a dynamic flow of these, the tenants that are in there. They may not all have leases that end exactly all on the same date, but we felt that a 20%, more than 20% occupancy by floor space in business use. So we actually did qualify. I was trying to keep my answer simple when I actually paraphrased it. But what we are saying is, if it's occupied by more than 20% by floor space in business use, it cannot be converted under permitted development rights for offices or light.
So you are talking there, you're talking really about a cluster of premises in one building, aren't you?
Well, often these are the sort of businesses that are actually
what you've just been talking about. Okay.
Yes, for permitted developments.
Okay.
Because it's the very small and micro businesses that are the most impacted by the use of
but you're talking about a collection of micro businesses in one building.
They tend to be.
Because a lot of these light industry premises are quite separate. They're not, they're not always clustered
absolutely.
together.
They're either fully occupied because there's one business in it taking the whole space, and that's a different kettle of fish.
I understand.
But we do know of an awful lot of these clusters which are actually essential to the health and sustainability of these very small businesses, because those are exactly the sort of spaces that they need, because they're often flexible.
No, I'm totally behind it. I'm just trying to, think of
I
ways
think
to
this is something where the mayor needs to find ways of what can be done within London plan policies to try and protect, or at least make it difficult for those uses to disappear under PD rights. Very quickly, Debbie, and then we need to. Sorry. We need to move on.
I was just going to say that I mean, sort of related to the permitted development issue. I mean, it's so important to good growth that light industry still remains in the capital. And if you look at, for example, areas like Old Kent Road, which are largely industrial areas and have a lot of different uses, including these quite sort of finer grain, maker, light industrial uses, and that's identified as an opportunity area and will be undergoing significant change. And so as part of the kind of, the work that we're doing with Southwark in that area, we're looking at, being more ambitious about mixed use in terms of light industrial mixed use, because actually, in some ways, the planning use classes are quite a blunt tool for looking at the activities that businesses are doing. And actually, as you were saying, sometimes businesses are doing quite different things within the same premises, and actually through design, through clever design, you can actually make very interesting mixed-use developments that enable those uses to carry on. So as much as it is about protecting existing space, where we're bringing forward new development in opportunity areas and on high streets, actually it's about being more ambitious about including those uses in future development. And
that's very interesting. Could I please just ask one question about Article 4? Is it Article 4?
Article 4 directions,
Yeah.
yes.
4 directions. The light in a lot of boroughs now, a number of boroughs anyway, have taken out Article 4 directions, anticipating the light industrial rule change coming up in October. Does that mean they've been granted? Does anyone know? Have they been granted? Because they've taken them out in advance.
We don't have data yet on the status of all of those. We're aware that a number of boroughs have brought them forward, and it may be that a number of boroughs bring forward what's called a non-immediate Article 4 direction, which means they allow for 12 months of consultation in advance of actually getting the Article 4 adopted and up and running. I think it's to overcome an issue around compensation with landowners who are affected. So, but we will be doing some work over the summer with the boroughs to identify what the different status and progress is on each of those Article 4 directions, which, as you say, will come in place in October. And the other point to mention is that there are provisions within the regulations for light industry which give boroughs an opportunity to protect light industrial space which is within a larger industrial areas. So we're hoping that through that, boroughs will be able to protect their light industrial space within the strategic industrial locations and their locally significant business areas. It's the smaller scale stuff, Nikki, that you were mentioning, which is going to be more at risk. And it's those areas where we'll be keen for boroughs to look at, in particular, where there are particularly valuable areas that they might want to bring forward the Article 4s to help protect those areas.
And how firm is an Article 4 direction?
So
I mean,
it does is
it's an instrument, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. It just removes the permitted development right. So it doesn't stop the landowner from putting in a planning application. So they can still put in a planning application to.
Then is the planning.
But then the planning authority has then got the decision-making power, whereas the permit development removes that decision.
Thank you.
Right. Can we move on to two specific areas, which is Harrow and Romford? Both have very ambitious regeneration programs. To start with, what does good growth mean to you in terms of what you're trying to do both in Harrow and Romford? There's one question. And also if you can tell us what has worked and what hasn't in your pursuit of a strong, big regeneration program. And what are the challenges you're facing in trying to access funding that's available? Do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start. It is an ambitious programme in Romford and Regeneration. What does good growth mean for us in terms of experience? I think it's not just thinking about it in terms of economic growth. That's the first thing. So it's also looking at it in terms of two other factors, which is one is well-being of citizens, really to a certain extent, and also looking at it in the context of also reduction of crime as well. So it's those three elements, and obviously some of that's done through the fund, and some of that work is done to support the work that's going on. One of the challenges we face is infrastructure. So when you've got a really broad, ambitious regeneration plan, you're also looking at the infrastructure to support the significant increase in population. And something that I mentioned earlier as well is we do have a gap in terms of not just application, but also in terms of understanding. Trying to get it working on a kind of wholesale basis, getting people on the same page is quite difficult. When I first came to Havering, my first analysis was based on where the gap was in terms of the town centre and the growth and those activities. And what we discovered was that the first element was centre management, as we did have the appearance of town centre management within the metropolitan centre, small town team growth in particular areas around, but actually it wasn't up to the level of capacity required to support wholesale change in our centres and our areas. So that's something we've had to look to address as long as the physical changes. It's also the above the line work as well. We obviously have a perception problem in Romford as well, which we've had to face off and address, and the political shifting and the infrastructure change in terms of local government, to be honest with you, haven't aided the delivery of some of the work that we've been planning to do. We have had some successes, it's good. Application and methodology is improved, as well as the understanding of good growth and the growth of the overall centre. And one of the focuses that we've had to address over the past particularly kind of 12 months is the missing market. We've realised there's actually a gap in terms of the usage of our centres. It's very much kind of a mono market, mono sector. And what we're trying to look at now is gender usage, different ethnics and culture usage within the area, that missing market, encouraging them to come into the town centre. And that's impacting on the decisions we're making in terms of the physical developments and again in terms of the management as well. Successes, the inclusion of the Business Improvement District, which goes to ballot in September, is actually quite an ambitious and kind of well-rounded business improvement district plan for the centre, and the growth in terms of developing the management in areas is also coming to the forefront. Physical works, we've had some challenges in terms of the market, which is one of those elements which was absolutely key to Romford. And if I'm being brutally honest, I think the problem there was the consultation and the engagement with the community, as well as the political influence wasn't strong enough. So that's caused an instability in terms of decision making. The vision has been there, but the kind of confidence in terms of taking the project all the way through that was originally placed isn't quite there at the moment, so it's gone to reassessment. In terms of the two physical areas, in terms of the new homes bonus work that we're doing as well, is moving forward incredibly positive. The Bridge Close development just on the Romford Town Centre has moved forward at an incredibly strong rate, and the quality of the homes and the mix of that space is very, very good, and is actually kind of, I wouldn't say future-proofed, but is looking actually a 5 or 10 year, suitable for the market in 5 and 10 years. But the overriding issue that we face to a certain extent is what we touched upon in the first element in terms of growth, is that gap. We've got quite a strong retail resilience, and we have done, which I think to a certain extent has made us quite confident as we move forward to some of the plans and decisions we've made. But as that's progressed since 2008, we've seen that gap in the leisure market for us. We aim to create an 18-hour economy. That's what we're focused on. We can't be a 24-hour economy, an 18-hour economy, but a balanced one and a diverse one. And some of the challenges we've been facing for a long time, we're now trying to kind of pick apart and deal with. And the gap is, one, our evening economy and usage. Our local district centres do very, very well to a certain extent in terms of usage. They're relatively resilient. But our centres, that gap within that 3 or 4 hours, and the cost of starting a business, sustaining a business, it's not just new business, we're very good there. It's about retention of the business we've got and helping them evolve and adapt and develop to suit that need. And we face that issue both in terms of retail and very much so in terms of leisure and the office sector specifically.
In your opening comment on challenges, you mentioned infrastructure.
Yes, with the significant increases in population, things like the accessibility to our centres, hospital usage, education, those elements, we have to look at how we're going to tackle that. We have a responsibility to increase the population of the town. That's a very, very positive element in terms of economy and usage, and looking at how these new spaces that we create, or these new residential areas that we create, access the town centre. We don't just create either a ghetto or an element that's kind of outside, and to make sure that we do have the infrastructure and the support and the services necessary for that growth in population and the type of people that we're going to get within the centre. Otherwise, obviously, we won't attract.
Can the Mayor and GLA assist with infrastructure or generally capacity if that's an issue?
Support, what we have, there's two elements really. Firstly is funding creates a cycle of opportunity. And I think, if I'm being briefly honest, a lot of the centres need to understand firstly what type of centre they are, who their market is and who they're looking to attract, and get a real genuine you know, understanding of that, and not what the centre can be, not what the centre wants to be, but what the centre actually can be in 5 or 10 years. And then it can make a solid plan. So then for the opportunities when the funding comes through and the GLAO support is there, it's not just this seems a great idea, this is what people are saying they want, either at kind of, you know, community level or at a political level. It's actually, this is actually a necessity and a requirement, which I think will make the argument for the application for funding a lot stronger, and also the measurement and the achievement of the key performance indicators that we place down there shouldn't just be to get the money, it should actually be to meet the actual need of where we're going to be in 5 or 10 years. So that harks back to what I said at the beginning, it's understanding actually what good growth is going to be and where your place needs to be in 5, 10, 15, 20 years time, and looking at the life cycle of the citizens within the place.
Ask you, are resident stakeholders with you in terms of what the vision of regeneration is as far as the council
I think there's two elements. Firstly, again, that gap that we saw in terms of that capacity, the engagement in terms of, you know, business improvement districts. We've only got one in the entire, you know, the borough, soon to have two. So all the community with us. We've just done a recent survey in Collier Road, and it was an online survey just generally about the feelings of the place and what they'd like to see happen. Within a period of 4 days, we actually got a response rate of 200 to 300 communities and residents. And it wasn't incredibly negative, it was actually incredibly realistic, and that's actually given us a good indication of the kind of work that we're going to take back to them to do, and that can be quite short. In terms of the actual business community themselves, what we've seen over the development of the business improvement district and the metropolitan centre is an actually really good engagement, but they feel neglected in terms of the use. They feel that they can only control 50% of their business, the 50% outside of their door, they're at the, you know, international, national, environmental kind of impacts, and also kind of locally. So the short answer to your question is potentially no, I don't think they are, and I think we've got to get a lot better, and I think this is across the whole kind of piece really, about engaging with communities and really getting an understanding of what they require and what they want, but also our responsibility to manage expectation. It's good to be aspirational, but they've also got to be realistic in what they're going to get and what they can, you know, they can deliver.
You said raised interesting issue about engagement of small businesses within that infrastructure or regeneration. Do you think you have got that engagement with small businesses or empowerment when it comes to improvement districts and how those are run?
In terms of business improvement, we're getting that now, but where we've had significant success is with social enterprise. And I think it's been one of the most positive things that's come out of the crash between there and now, is actually that there's organisations that have grown literally about wanting to change and do something really, really positive for a centre or a place. And I think we've got to ask ourselves the question whether we're investing into those organisations and we trust them to do some of the bigger work, because what we're seeing there is better engagement, more innovation, you know, more aspiration. They're creating gaps within centres that we just as local authorities can't actually deliver. You know, and I think that's where the secondary support, I think you touched upon it, Erin, as well, is that broad base built between those organisations that have grown. We've got to get a lot stronger engagement in those and use those arm's length, you know, cultural regeneration companies, you know, in community-based regeneration companies, things like town teams. I was part of the Portus DCLG as one of the advisors on that. A lot of enthusiasm, but not a lot of structure, not a lot of planning, because they didn't feel that the money was going to come to invest into the projects to see the change. And I think there's a gap there, particularly within district centres, the smaller areas. If they can be empowered and also funded, I think we'll actually see some very strong work that hits that whole trinity of not just economic growth, but greater well-being for the community, and also a reduction in crime that makes the basis of, I suppose, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, really. We're giving them what they need, but we're also making them feel safe and secure, which I think we'll see greater use of a centre. And if we keep measuring it by just purely economic growth, I think we're always going to be in the same seat all the time, really, seeing the challenge. I think it's about whether people are happy, content, and actually kind of getting a well-rounded experience within the centre.
Mark, we had a very good site visit to Harrow, going around Billington and opportunity areas, etc. Do you want to give an overview in the context of...
I suppose the first thing you said was what good growth means to us. Yeah. Our regeneration strategy, we looked at 3 areas. So one was the place, which is, you know, homes and the town centre and schools and the infrastructure. The other one was communities, and it's also, you know, it is really about how people benefit from that. So it is about addressing worklessness, addressing low skills, addressing low pay, which are real issues. I mean, low pay is a big one where we are because we've had all our job growth has primarily been low paid jobs. And then the third thing is around businesses. And again, it's ensuring that regeneration programme, local businesses do benefit and that we do develop local supply chains and that we are also supporting business growth, start-up, but also growth of existing businesses. So we've got that holistic approach. What has worked for us? I mean, I started sort of list of things beforehand, and obviously, I can give you areas and the job growth that we've had, and we can give you figures on private sector investment, which has been levered into the borough. Obviously, we set up our bid as well. But as to why things worked, I think there's probably a few reasons. One of them was that everything that we've applied for through the GLA has been based upon existing plans, so based upon the core strategy, the area action plan, our regeneration strategy. So it's not come from nothing, it's come from sort of an evidence base of need. The other thing is there was strong political support. So again, it's been championed by the deputy leader, who's also the portfolio holder, but it's been agreed through a regeneration board, and then once we've got something agreed, there are local programme boards with ward members that are part of that decision-making process. And I think the third thing was actually, on our side, there has been really strong business engagement. So the programme in Harrow Town Centre, the first one actually, which led to the creation of the Business Improvement District, because the three anchors, if you like, St Anne's, St George's and Debenhams, are really keen on actually creating a bid and taking ownership of that area, and almost taking ownership for a vacuum that was created because we didn't have funding to invest in additional town centre management or address antisocial behaviour. And the other one, again, Station Road, the local businesses there, they were really keen on creating an identity for their area. I mean, we had a shopping parade which didn't even have a name, so how can you have an identity? I'll just come along to, come along to Station Road, which has got 1,500 units on the bloody thing, and you might find us in the middle somewhere. So no, but they were really enthusiastic about that, and I think our engagement has worked. I mean, I said to you earlier, we work through a whole range of different organisations to try and get out to businesses. So I'm glad that I met you because we can work with some more now. Challenges, though, and I'll do some different challenges for you. Otherwise, it's going to be the same. I think there's been a real issue sometimes on land ownership and landlords. Yeah. When it comes to regeneration programmes. So there are particular schemes that you may want to implement, but actually trying to identify who the landlord for an area is incredible sometimes when you look at multiple units in town centres. That stopped one of our regeneration programmes in the town centre in relation to catenary lighting. It was a real issue in trying to identify landlords for pop-up shops and bringing in space back into use. And then when we did identify them, often they wanted unrealistic rent levels because they heard that we had regeneration plans. But and the third one, and it's there's no one for Transport for London. If there was, I'd look at them and say it's all your fault. Is actually, I think it took 9 months to agree an easement to put a 100mm pipe, a drainage pipe, from one piece of parkland to another piece. And some of the problems you have, around those are really silly. I think the other thing is, and I'll be critical because we are allowed to be critical, is that one of the problems here is that we attend design panels and design review panels. And it seems to me sometimes that the process over the last few years has been a design-led programme rather than actually a programme which has been addressing deprivation. So often we want you to, the design's got to be doing this. We're not really interested upon, sustainability in relation to materials that are being used, how those materials are going to be cleansed, the operation of particular buildings, because we're focused on design. If we were addressing a social or economic panel, I think actually that the pressures would have been completely different, because you'd be asking questions about how many people have you supported into employment? How many apprenticeships have you created? How many businesses are benefiting from what you're doing? But actually the questions are always around design. And I think that if you want the Good Growth Fund actually to be different, then you need to think about the sort of questions that you're asking the recipients of funding. Because at the moment, it does feel like it's been a trickle-down approach to regeneration in relation to addressing deprivation in areas. So again, you know, we can talk about job growth, but you're not measuring how many local people have benefited from that job growth. So those are some of the challenges.
Thank you. Erin, you wanted to
I
respond.
was just going to respond. Yeah, I mean, I think we've been having that conversation a lot in our team in the development of this fund. And so last night, as I said, the Mayor launched our Good Growth by Design programme. Obviously, it has the word design in it. But the idea is that it's design in all forms. And at the end, so the Mayor's also appointed a panel of what we're calling Mayor's Design Advocates. But they're actually not all from a design background. The idea is that it's looking more holistically at projects, like their environmental, their benefits, the place benefits and social benefits. So it's more of a kind of a holistic look at what makes a good project, and that design is one part of that. But it's also the design of the, you know, of the process of the project, rather than design being just the kind of physical regeneration aspects. So there is a concerted effort from the GLA to look at good growth more holistically and think about the social impact of things. And that also, on that point that you made about making sure that beneficiaries of jobs are local, for example, like our local people benefiting, we're at the process of rewriting our outputs handbook so that we're not just counting jobs, we're also looking at equalities data, you know, who are those people who are getting those jobs, and looking at both emergent, so new people coming to the area accessing jobs, but also the existing community, because there has been some discrepancy on previous sort of evaluation we've done on previous projects where people feel like new arrivals to the area are benefiting more than existing communities or existing businesses. So it's about trying to address that in the new funding programme.
Okay, Denise, do you want to reflect on anything you heard from Harrow?
Thank you very much for inviting me along today. It's been good to hear a lot of the topics that are being raised, and actually reassuring that a lot of our concerns are also understood by people here today, so thank you. But just carry on protecting our small business community in London. We don't want to become a dormitory London that's just everybody is on the outside coming into living on the inside and going out. I don't think our transport system is set up for that. We want to preserve London's unique personality, and protecting our town centres all across London is the way to actually do that, we believe.
Andrew, you want to raise your last question?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting lead-in to what I was going to ask about, which is particularly to Johnny and Mark, which is about the cultural offer that can also come with it. And I suppose in that context, when I was going to ask about the nighttime economy as well, I mean, you see that as part of the project.
So like
Yeah, you pick up on that.
I think it really needs to be centred. Where we've seen success is with the cultural regeneration organisations we work with, and they've actually managed to kind of marry both, you know, business incubation growth with actually a cultural offer. And again, it's that missing market that I talked about, is, you know, creating new things within that area. When we've given them support, what we've seen is cultural incubator, street entertainment programme, you know, street art, and they've done it in such a significant, quick and high quality way. They've got international recognition for some of their work. That's where we really feel that we can win on a regular basis. In terms of nighttime economy, I've been working in nighttime economy for 10 years. Nightworks focuses on diversification and self-regulation. So coming into Romford was quite an interesting piece of work, really. They did some really good work in terms of the nighttime economy, because obviously there has been and still is a perception problem for the nighttime economy in Romford particularly. Where they struggle, no, it's not just resource, it's about attracting new business, but also the instinct is to move towards more command and control. And the question is does command and control, clustering, monoculture in terms of alcohol, work in terms of diversifying and attracting new business? The answer is no, it isn't. It's got to be more self-regulation. But we're trapped in that area in Romford, particularly as a major centre for the night time, because it is relatively successful, but it still captures that 18 to 24-year-old market. And what we really want, which suits the modern need of the centre, is more restaurants, more places suitable to people who don't want to drink alcohol, more leisure activities. And we're starting to see that, but it's still tentative. And so those small businesses that grow, who are innovative and actually kind of put themselves forward, the market isn't quite strong enough to attract them into the centre, so it continues the cycle. And the second element is we have a lot of clustering in Romford in terms of the nighttime economy. The bars are all together as soon as you get off the station, which means it's not a welcoming centre if you're coming with a family or you're slightly older. You know, and those elements in terms of solid infrastructure, again, lighting and environment, we can't meet the need for that change. But we also, because of permitted development, can't encourage restaurants to come into a different district or a different area. We're relying quite heavily on broad sweeping change, where in fact more restaurants, more leisure areas in the office district for us, or in a slightly more deprived town street just off. It just isn't possible at the moment. So, you know, we refer to it as a cultural wasteland of Greater London, which is not a kind of nice, a nice label. I'd like to, you know, fully, you know, kind of challenge that, but we've seen quite a lot of grassroots movement, but the funding isn't there, and I think it's the responsibility of local authorities to really shift to actually kind of see those two things as an absolute priority for us.
In parallel to what's going on here, I'm on the Economy Committee, and we're doing some work on the nighttime economy more generally. We had a workshop last week, and one thing that struck what my main things came out of that, one thing in particular was, we talk about the nighttime economy, we're actually talking about two different things, talking about the evening economy and the nighttime economy, and the two are not necessarily the same thing.
Exactly, yeah, I agree. It should be ENTE, if I'm being pretty honest, but it's obviously it has a medical connotation that can obviously cause some confusion. We had an issue in terms of diversification and self-regulation. We were talking about this with the first round of AAAs with the Home Office at Night Works. And what we found is people were often saying in the centres we work with, and this was nationally, not just London, that they would turn around and say, yes, we want to diversify our evening economy or a nighttime economy, but the actual general assessment of their volume of value, the mix, just wasn't solid enough. You know, we had to do a solid assessment first. If they didn't have a purple flag, then they didn't have the gap analysis that was required. And secondly, nighttime economy means something completely different to different sectors and different demographics completely. An evening economy is the bridge between the daytime and the nighttime. And I think you can encourage daytime operations to diversify. I'm seeing nighttime bars now that are strong drinking establishments, although well run, good operators are actually having small children areas in the daytime, which is a positive move in the right direction. But to create an evening economy, you've got to have something that those that work and live in the town centre want to come and engage with. And within the free market economy we have at the moment, attracting those businesses into outer London boroughs is incredibly difficult. You have to rely on incubation spaces, creative cultural organisations to step in there, or soft interventions, night markets, things you can control that change the feel and environment of the place. So it needs a strong evening nighttime economy strategy in a holistic 18-hour model. And if you've got that, I think you can move towards it quite comfortably.
Okay, so culture. Navi mentioned earlier that they came down to a visit to Wildstone, where we saw the art studio, the artist space that we just created. I was pleasantly surprised, because when we said that we were going to create a sort of our first affordable artist studios, or even our first artist studios in Harrow, I assumed that the market would be from all of those people who can't afford to work in East London anymore. But actually, the units have all been let, and they've been let locally. So there was a local offer that we weren't aware of. And perhaps I should have been aware of that, because one of the things you mentioned earlier was social capital. In the earlier funding rounds, you know, when we've had pop-up art galleries, that art has all been done from A-level art students. When we did something in town centres before, we created banners, all of those banners celebrating, you know, getting school children to think about their relationship with their local shopping centre. They were created again with artists working with school children. So there's a lot that you can sort of do on the art side that is not necessarily how you would traditionally think about things. On the traditional thing, we secured again money from you to build our a pavilion stroke cafe, and that pavilion is being used as a centre for performing arts in Lowlands. and I was there last week, and it's working well. I'm pleased. So we are starting to grow a cultural offer in the borough. I think, unlike you, so we're not dead in that area, but our nighttime economy is probably dead. And I think that when we've had events in the town centre, it's quite striking, because about 6:30 or 7 o'clock, after you've had the event and after something's been going on, it's where do we go now? Because suddenly everybody's just closed. They've just closed the doors. And again, it is sometimes a landlord issue, because the landlords at the big two anchor stores, St Anne's and St George's shopping centres, they close up, and the tenants have all been told that you close at this particular time. So I'll probably learn from you when it comes to sitting down chatting with you. Well, no, but you do, for others. I'll sit and chat with Johnny about learning about the nighttime economy, and we'll just do a little bit more engagement with your members on the business side.
And again, with the cultural work we've done, I just need to say this, is that I do honestly believe without the support of the GLA and the funds, we wouldn't have seen the growth of that cultural offer within Romford, because the organisation do a significant amount with a little. I mean, the retailery project has been a rip-roaring success. You know, generally they incubate 14 businesses so far, both leisure and professional services. And the street art programme, again, we wouldn't have seen that in Romford, because we actually do get resistance from a political position on this. You know, community-wise, at the officer level, you know, it's embraced and encouraged, and we've had significant support from the GLA to get that going, but it does feel sometimes they're pushing against the tide. So, you know, additional support probably would be good.
Can I just add one extra bit regarding the nighttime economy and the cultural exchange? That, especially with the push for more housing as well, you often get tension with residential and business, and especially where there's been a really beautiful, long-standing, traditional, cultural, entertainment venue that suddenly ends up having to have ridiculous requirements to put in sound insulation or to close their beer garden at 9 o'clock because the local neighbours don't like to hear sounds in the garden and things like that. So I think there does need to be more direction in town centre areas to protect the businesses that are established when new residential opportunities arise. And the other point I'd just like to make as well is that with the nighttime economy, don't forget all of these businesses and the daytime ones all need to be serviced. Now, the Mayor's transport strategy is out at the moment, and obviously the FSB will be making a response to that. But we do need to make sure that with nighttime economies as they develop, that actually thought is given to how you actually service those businesses that are operating at different hours to conventional business hours, so that they can actually receive the goods to keep the businesses going. And again, that can be a problem in some boroughs because of the London Lorry Control Scheme. And I know there's a review going on of that, which we have contributed to. So again, it's part of it, but it's often the unseen part of how an economy or a particular commercial operation actually is happening. We all need the deliveries. At the end of the day, if the pubs run out of beer, they can't sell any, can they? So.
Anything else, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are the sort of points you're taking up on the Economy Committee, and I think, you know, it is right. It is important you find the right balance between residents and businesses. I mean, if the businesses are there first, it's a bit like living next to the fire station and complaining about the hooters. Or next to the church and complaining about the bells on Sunday. The question is what comes first. But if the residents are there first, and then you get something plonked on top of them, then that's when you, I think
that's a different thing, because the business understands it. But I think there's been too many examples, and it's not just a London problem. I think this is a UK-wide one, where noise complaints. I'm aware of the Arcadia Centre in Birmingham had a real problem with the new flats that were built near it, and they actually closed down a very, very long-established entertainment venue as a result.
The Mayor's now coming with the agent of change.
Exactly. That's the answer, really.
Which is the answer, and it's going to be hopefully applied to industrial premises too, so that it's incumbent on the developer to make sure that the noise, the dust, all the different things that you want your residents or potential residents to be insulated from are insulated from.
Yeah, well, the example that was the Curzon Cinema when they did all that properly.
Right. Well, we've had a great discussion. That's end of our conversation on the regeneration and good growth for town centres. May I, on behalf of the committee, thank all of our panelists for coming along today. and making some vital contributions. Please feel free to write in if you got any further thoughts or input you might want to provide. Now, we have a tiny bit of business still to conduct. Feel free to remain or to go as you find convenient. Can we please, colleagues, note the report and the discussion with the invited guests? Can we note the summary of our site visits to Wembley and Wilstone on 15th of June? And can we delegate authority to me in consultation with Deputy Chair to agree any output from this review today? Yeah. Okay. Penultimate item number 10, Regeneration Committee's work program. Can we note the reminder of our meeting dates in 17-18 Assembly year as set out in paragraph 3.1 of the report? Yeah. Can we agree our work program as set out in the report and delegate authority to me in consultation with Deputy Chair to agree the scope in terms of reference for the committee scrutiny review of convergence in growth boroughs? Great. And the last item, date of next meeting. The next formal meeting of the committee is scheduled for Wednesday, 6th of September at 2 p.m. in Committee Room 5. Can you agree to that? Well, I haven't had any other business, urgent business informed, so I declare this meeting closed. Thank you very much.
6th of September.